People always wondered why Frank Sinatra allowed Dean Martin to make fun of him on stage. If you watch the old tapes of the Rat Pack at the Sands, you see it. Frank was the chairman of the board. He was a man who snapped his fingers and presidents jumped. He was a man with a temper so volatile that waiters shook when they poured his coffee. Nobody insulted Frank Sinatra. Nobody touched Frank Sinatra. If Don Rickles made a joke about Frank, he did it with fear in his eyes. But Dean would walk onto that stage holding a cigarette and a drink, and he would destroy Frank. He would flick cigarette ash on Frank's tuxedo. He would push him aside. He would mock his singing, his height, his love life, and his toupee. And Frank would just stand there and laugh. He would look at Dean with a look of pure, unadulterated adoration. It was the look of a younger brother gazing up at his hero. Why? Why did the most powerful man in show business let Dean Martin get away with murder? What the audience never knew was that backstage at the Sands, Frank kept a photograph in his dressing room. Just one. Not Ava, not the president, not even his kids. It was a grainy black and white photo of a Manhattan apartment building on West 57th Street. The building was unremarkable, but Frank would touch that photo before every show like a good luck charm. The answer isn't in the jokes. The answer lies in a single freezing night in 1952, November 13th, 1952 to be exact. The night Frank Sinatra hit rock bottom. The night the music stopped, the lights went out, and the voice was ready to silence itself forever. It was the night Frank Sinatra knelt on the floor of a lonely apartment, ready to die, and Dean Martin was the only hand that reached down into the abyss to pull him up. But here's what nobody tells you. Dean wasn't supposed to be in New York that night. He was supposed to be in Los Angeles, filming The Caddy with Jerry Lewis. He had a 6 a.m. call time. Missing it would have cost him $50,000 in penalties, a fortune in 1952. Dean got on a plane anyway. The Fall. To understand the magnitude of that night, we have to strip away the legend. We have to forget the Frank Sinatra of My Way and New York, New York. We have to go back to 1950, 1951, and 1952, the years the world forgot. In the 1940s, Frank had been a god. He was the voice. He made Bobby Soxers faint. He was the biggest star on the planet. But fame is a cruel mistress, and by 1950, she had found a new lover. Post-war America was changing. The sweet, sentimental ballads that made Frank famous were going out of style. The soldiers coming home didn't want to hear a skinny kid from Hoboken croon about moonlight. They wanted energy. And then tragedy struck. Frank's voice began to fail him. It happened at the Copacabana in New York, April 26, 1950, the most prestigious club in the city. Frank was on stage reaching for a high note in Bali High, and his throat simply closed, a vocal cord hemorrhage. He opened his mouth, and nothing came out but a dry rasp. The silence in that room was deafening. Here's what the history books don't tell you. In the audience that night was a young singer named Tony Bennett. He watched Frank collapse on stage. Years later, Bennett would say in a private interview that never made it to print, "I saw a man die that night. Not physically, but I watched his soul leave his body." The Frank Sinatra who walked off that stage was a different man than the one who walked on. It wasn't just a missed note. It was the sound of a career dying. The press who had built him up turned on him like a pack of wolves. They smelled blood. The headlines were brutal. Frankie finished. The voice is silenced, gone and forgotten. His record label, Columbia, dropped him. His agent, MCA, dropped him. MGM Studios fired him. He was a pariah. He couldn't get a hit record. He couldn't get a movie role. He was walking through Times Square looking up at the marquees and seeing the names of new stars, Eddie Fisher, Frankie Lane, while his own name was nowhere to be found. The psychological warfare was methodical. Frank's former publicist at Columbia, a man named George Evans who had built Frank's career, died of a heart attack in January 1950. Frank blamed himself. Evans had been working himself to death trying to salvage Frank's reputation. At the funeral, Frank sobbed so hard he couldn't stand. Nancy Sinatra had to hold him up. Without Evans, Frank had no shield against the media, no one to spin the narrative. He was alone. And while Frank was falling, Dean was rising. Dean and Jerry were the biggest act in the world. They were printing money. They were the kings of comedy. Every time Frank turned on the radio or opened a newspaper, he saw Dean's face smiling back at him. It must have eaten him alive. The jealousy, the shame, the feeling of being replaced. But here's the twist. Dean was watching Frank fall, and it terrified him, because Dean knew something the public didn't. Dean Martin, the cool, unflappable entertainer, suffered from crippling anxiety. He saw himself in Frank's collapse. He saw his own future. What happens when the laughter stops? What happens when Jerry doesn't need me anymore? Dean started calling Frank every week, not to gloat, not to offer pity, just to talk. Sometimes they'd talk about nothing, the weather, horses, girls. Other times Frank would cry and Dean would just listen. Dean never told Jerry about these calls, never told anyone. But the career failure was only half the story. The real poison in Frank's veins had a name: Ava Gardner. The night. November 13th, 1952, a Thursday. The temperature in New York City was 34 degrees. It felt colder. Ava was in Africa filming Magambo. She wasn't answering his calls. The newspapers were reporting that she was having an affair with Clark Gable. Frank was in New York, alone. He had no gigs, he had no money, he had no voice, and he believed, truly believed, he had no future. What happened earlier that day? Frank had gone to the offices of William Morris, his last remaining representation. He sat in a waiting room for 2 hours. When he finally got in to see his agent, Mort Viner, the meeting lasted 7 minutes. Viner told him, "Frank, I can't get you work. Nobody wants you. Maybe it's time to think about another career." Frank walked out. He didn't say goodbye. He stopped at a payphone and called Dean's house in Los Angeles. Jeannie, Dean's wife, answered. Dean was at the studio. Frank didn't leave a message. He hung up. The apartment was cold. It was one of those New York nights where the wind rattles the window panes, a sound that emphasizes loneliness. Frank Sinatra sat on the edge of the bed. He was wearing an undershirt and slacks. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. The apartment was littered with empty bottles, overflowing ashtrays, and unread scripts. Scripts for terrible B-movies that he couldn't even get an audition for. He looked in the mirror and he didn't recognize the man staring back. The blue eyes were dull, rimmed with red. The cheeks were hollow. He looked like a ghost. "You're nothing," the voice in his head whispered. "You're a joke. You're a one-hit wonder who stayed at the party too long." He walked to the kitchen. The linoleum floor was cold against his bare feet. He looked at the gas oven. It's a story that has been whispered about for decades. Some say he had a gun, some say pills, but the most pervasive story, the one that fits the sheer desperation of the moment, is the gas. It was a quiet way to go. No noise, no mess, just sleep. Frank turned the knob. Sssss. The sound of the gas escaping was like a snake. He sat on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He closed his eyes. He thought about his kids. Little Nancy was 9. Frank Jr. was 8. Tina was only 4. They'd be better off without him. Nancy would remarry, a good man, someone stable. He thought about Ava. She was probably laughing right now on set in Africa, free of him, finally free. He thought about the applause he would never hear again. He was ready. He had accepted it. The world didn't need Frank Sinatra anymore. Minutes passed. The smell of gas began to fill the small kitchen. Frank's head began to swim. He felt heavy. He felt the darkness closing in, a comforting blanket that would take away the pain of being a failure. And then a sound cut through the haze. Bang, bang, bang. Someone was pounding on the apartment door.
The rescue. Here's what really happened that afternoon.
Dean was on the Paramount lot filming a scene with Jerry Lewis. It was a comedy bit. Jerry was supposed to hit Dean in the face with a cream pie. Dean kept missing his mark. The director called cut 4 times. Jerry was getting annoyed. Dean couldn't concentrate. Something was wrong. He felt it in his gut. He walked off the set at 2:15 p.m., didn't tell anyone where he was going. He drove to his house in Beverly Hills. Jeannie was in the kitchen making lunch for the kids. Dean asked if anyone had called. Jeannie mentioned Frank's call, said he sounded strange, didn't leave a message. Dean went cold. He called Frank's apartment in New York. No answer. He called again. No answer. Dean called Hank Sanicola, Frank's former manager. Hank told him, "Dean, Frank called me yesterday. He was talking like he was saying goodbye. I tried to go over there, but he wouldn't let me in." Dean hung up the phone. He walked into his bedroom. Jeannie followed him. She watched him pack a bag. "Dean, you have a 6 a.m. call time tomorrow," she said. "I know," Dean said. "They'll fine you $50,000. "I know." "Dean!" He turned to her. His eyes were wet. Dean Martin never cried. "If I don't go," he said, "Frank's gonna die tonight." Dean drove to LAX. He bought a ticket on the next flight to New York. It cost $347. He had $89 in his wallet. He wrote a check. Pan Am Flight 102 departed at 4:45 p.m. The flight across the country was 5 hours and 23 minutes. Dean sat in first class, chain-smoking Lucky Strikes. A stewardess asked for his autograph. Dean didn't hear her. He was doing math in his head. California was 3 hours behind New York. It was 7:45 p.m. in New York when he took off. Frank had been alone all day. Dean prayed. He wasn't religious, but he prayed anyway. The plane landed at Idlewild Airport at 1:08 a.m. New York time, November 14th. Dean didn't wait for his luggage. He ran through the terminal. He caught a cab, gave the driver Frank's address and a $100 bill. "Fast," Dean said. The cab driver, a man named Julius Klein, would later tell reporters, "I had Dean Martin in my cab and he was crying. I've been driving this city for 30 years, never seen anything like it." The traffic in Manhattan was light. The cab pulled up to the building at 1:47 a.m. Dean took the stairs, 4th floor. He didn't wait for the elevator. Bang, bang, bang. Someone was pounding on the apartment door. Frank ignored it. He didn't want to be saved. He wanted to sleep. Bang, bang, bang. "Frankie, open the damn door!" The voice was muffled but familiar. It wasn't the police. It wasn't a landlord. It was a voice that sounded like bourbon and smoke. Frank tried to stand up, but his legs were weak. The pounding continued, relentless. Frank crawled to the door. He reached up, turned the lock. The door burst open. Dean didn't say hello. He didn't smile. He smelled the gas instantly. He pushed past Frank, rushing into the kitchen. He turned the knobs off. He threw open the window, letting the freezing New York air rush into the apartment, mixing with the deadly fumes. Frank was slumped in the hallway, coughing, crying. He was a mess, a broken, sobbing heap of a man. Dean walked back to him. He didn't hug him. He didn't offer sympathy. Not yet. He grabbed Frank by the shoulders and hauled him up. He dragged him into the living room and threw him onto the sofa. "What the hell are you doing?" Dean asked. His voice wasn't angry. It was terrified. But Dean Martin never showed terror. He masked it with cool. "I'm done, Dee," Frank sobbed, putting his head in his hands. "I'm done. It's over. She's gone. The voice is gone. I got nothing." Dean looked around the squalid apartment. He saw the poverty. He saw the despair. He realized how close he had come to reading his friend's obituary in the morning paper.
The conversation. Dean went to the sidebar. He found a bottle of whiskey that wasn't empty. He poured 2 glasses. He handed one to Frank. "Drink," Dean commanded. Frank took the glass with shaking hands. He drank. The liquor burned his throat, waking him up. Dean sat down on the coffee table directly across from Frank. He lit a cigarette and handed it to Frank. "You ain't done, D," Dean said quietly. "Look at me," Frank screamed, gesturing to his unshaven face, his dirty clothes. "Look at me, Dean. I'm a bum. I'm borrowing money from my agent to buy dinner. MGM won't even let me on the lot. I'm a punchline." "So what?" Dean shrugged. "So you're down. You think you're the first guy to take a beating? You think I haven't been broke? I shoveled coal in Steubenville, Frank. I dealt cards to murderers for $5 a night. Being broke ain't a death sentence. It's just a Tuesday." "It's different for you," Frank argued. "You're funny. People love you. I'm supposed to be the voice. Without that, I'm nobody." Dean leaned forward. This was the moment, the turning point. And here's what Dean said that nobody knows, the words that saved Frank Sinatra's life. "You know what Jerry Lewis told me last week?" Dean said. He said, "Dean, you're lucky you're funny, because without me, you'd be nothing." You know what I said? Frank looked up. I said, "You're right." And you know why I said that, Frank? Because I don't give a damn what Jerry Lewis thinks. I know who I am, with or without the jokes, with or without the movies. I'm Dean Martin. And you, Frank, you're Frank Sinatra. You ain't nobody. You're the best singer God ever put on this earth. And yeah, maybe your pipes are rusty right now. Maybe you got a broken heart, but you're still Frank. And you know what? 20 years from now, nobody's going to remember Eddie Fisher. Nobody's going to remember Frankie Lane. But they're going to remember you. Because you got something they don't have. You got soul, kid. You got pain. And pain makes the best art. "Ava," Frank whispered. "Forget Ava. She's a hurricane, Frank. You can't hold on to a hurricane. Let her go. You've got to focus on you. You've got to get back in the ring." Dean looked at Frank. He saw something in Dean's eyes that he hadn't seen in anyone's eyes in years. Respect. Dean didn't pity him. Dean believed in him. Dean reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a checkbook. He wrote a check, a big one, $5,000, more than most Americans made in a year in 1952. "Here," Dean said, sliding it across the table. "Pay your rent, buy a suit, get a shave. You look like hell." Frank looked at the check. It was charity. His pride flared up. "I don't want your money, Dean. It ain't a loan, it's an interest. You're going to pay me back with interest." "How?" Frank asked bitterly. "I can't get a job." "You get a job because you're going to stop feeling sorry for yourself and you're going to fight. There's a movie, right? That war movie you're always talking about." "From here to eternity," Frank muttered. "They don't want me. Harry Cohn hates me." "Make them want you. Beg if you have to. Fight for it. Work for nothing. Just get the part. Because once you're on that screen, Frank, once they see what you can do, they're going to remember." Dean stayed all night. He didn't leave Frank alone for a second. They drank the whole bottle. They talked about the old days. They talked about music. They talked until the sun came up. At 6:15 a.m., Dean walked to the window and opened the curtains. Light flooded the apartment. Frank shielded his eyes. "You see that?" Dean said, pointing to the sunrise. "That's a new day, Pally. You get another shot. Don't waste it." Dean made jokes, terrible, stupid jokes, until Frank finally cracked a smile. Dean Martin didn't perform a miracle that night. He didn't cure Frank's voice. He didn't bring Ava back. He did something more important. He reminded Frank Sinatra of who he was. He held up a mirror to the broken man and showed him the king inside.
The Brotherhood.
This is why the Rat Pack worked. People think it was just a group of guys drinking and partying. No, it was a brotherhood forged in the fire of survival. Frank was the leader. Yes, he was the loud one, the organizer, the one who picked the fights. But Dean was the anchor. Dean was the only man Frank considered his equal. Frank allowed Dean to mock him on stage because it was Dean's way of keeping him humble. It was Dean's way of saying, "Remember the kitchen floor, Frank. Remember who we really are. We're just a couple of Italian kids who got lucky." Every time Dean flicked ash on Frank's shoulder, he was grounding him, and Frank loved him for it. The ritual nobody talks about. Before every Rat Pack show at the Sands, Frank and Dean would meet in Frank's dressing room 15 minutes before curtain, just the two of them. They'd have a drink, they wouldn't talk much. Frank would put his hand on Dean's shoulder and say, "Thanks, Pally." Every single night, for years. Dean would nod. They both knew what it meant. Years later, when they were on stage in St. Louis, Frank stopped the show to introduce Dean. He didn't use a joke. He didn't use a nickname. He put his arm around Dean and said to the audience, "This is my right arm. Without him, I couldn't swing." It was a public confession of the debt he could never repay. The tragedy. The tragedy is that while Dean saved Frank, Frank couldn't save Dean. When Dean Paul Martin Jr., Dean's beloved son, died in a plane crash on March 21, 1987, Dean Martin's light went out. Dean Jr. was a fighter pilot in the California Air National Guard. His F-4 Phantom jet crashed into Mount San Gorgonio during a snowstorm. He was 35 years old. They didn't find his body for a week. Dean stopped performing. He stopped leaving his house. He would sit in his bedroom watching old movies, drinking, smoking. He wanted to die. The cool, unflappable Dean Martin was gone. Frank tried. He tried everything. He launched a reunion tour in 1988, billed as the ultimate event, with Sammy Davis Jr. Dean agreed to do it. Frank thought the stage would save him, like it had saved Frank. But Dean's darkness was different. Dean's darkness was a choice. Dean walked off the tour after 5 shows. Frank begged him to stay. They fought backstage in Chicago. Frank said, "Dino, please, you saved me once. Let me save you now." Dean looked at Frank with hollow eyes and said, "Some people can't be saved, Pally. You got lucky. I'm not gonna." That was the last real conversation they ever had. Frank called Dean every Christmas after that. Dean would answer. They'd talk for a few minutes, pleasantries, the weather. Frank would ask, "You coming over for dinner?" Dean would say, "Maybe next time." There was never a next time. When Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, Frank Sinatra was destroyed. The press asked him for a statement. Frank, who was famous for his eloquence, couldn't find the words. He simply said, "Dean was my brother, not by blood, but by choice." What the press didn't report, Frank tried to attend Dean's funeral. His nurse, Vine, drove him to the cemetery. Frank sat in the car for 30 minutes, staring at the crowd of mourners. He couldn't get out. He couldn't face it. He asked Vine to take him home. That night, Frank sat in his study and drank an entire bottle of Jack Daniels. He looked at the photograph of the Manhattan apartment building. He touched it, and he whispered, "I should have saved you, Dean. I should have saved you." Legend has it that in his final days, Frank Sinatra, lost in the fog of dementia, would often call out for Dean. He would forget that Dean was gone. He would ask his nurse, "Where's Dino? Is he coming over? We need to talk." Maybe in his mind he was back in that cold apartment in 1952, waiting for the knock on the door, waiting for the man in the camel hair coat to come and save him one last time. The parallel. Here's what this story means today. In 2026, we live in a world of Instagram and TikTok. We see people's highlight reels. We see their success, their perfect lives. We don't see the kitchen floor. We don't see the gas oven. We don't see the nights when they're alone, scrolling through their phones, wondering if they matter, wondering if they should just give up. We've lost 100,000 people to suicide every year in America. That's 274 people every single day. That's one person every 6 minutes. And you know what the statistics say? Most people who died by suicide reached out to someone in the final 24 hours. A phone call, a text, a visit. They were looking for a Dean Martin, someone to kick down the door. Sometimes we're the Frank on the kitchen floor. Sometimes we're the Dean on the airplane. The question is, will we make the choice Dean made? Will we get on the plane even when it costs us everything? The lesson. We all need a Dean Martin in our lives. We all have moments where the oven looks tempting, where the darkness feels like the only option. We all hit rock bottom. And in those moments, we don't need a lecture. We don't need judgment. We need a friend who will kick down the door, turn off the gas, pour us a drink, and tell us that we are still worth something. Frank Sinatra was the greatest singer of all time, but he wouldn't have been if not for Dean Martin. The world owes Dean Martin a thank you, because without him, we wouldn't have My Way. We wouldn't have Fly Me to the Moon. We wouldn't have the soundtrack of our lives. He saved the voice, and in doing so, he saved a piece of all of us. But here's the final twist, the one Dean never told anyone. In 1995, a few months before Dean died, a reporter asked him about that night in 1952. Dean was old by then, tired. He'd never spoken about it publicly. The reporter said, "How did you know Frank was in trouble that night? How did you know to get on that plane?" Dean took a long drag of a cigarette. He looked at the reporter with those sad brown eyes, and he said, "Because I was in my kitchen once too, looking at the gas oven, thinking about turning it on, and nobody came for me. I had to save myself. It took me 10 years to realize I was worth saving. I wasn't going to let Frank take 10 years. I wasn't going to let him die thinking he was alone." The reporter never published that quote. Dean asked him not to, said it was too personal, but the reporter kept the tape. Years later, he gave it to the Sinatra family. That's the real story. Dean Martin didn't just save Frank Sinatra because they were friends. Dean saved Frank because Dean knew what that darkness felt like, and he knew that nobody should have to climb out of it alone.
The call to action. If this story moved you, if you didn't know how close we came to losing Frank Sinatra, do something. Don't just hit like. Don't just subscribe. Call your Dean Martin, the friend who has your back. Thank them. Tell them what they mean to you. And if you're on the kitchen floor right now, if you're looking at the gas oven, if you're wondering if anyone would care if you were gone, someone will come. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but someone will come. And until they do, you hold on. You hold on because the world needs your voice, even if you can't hear it right now. Frank Sinatra almost died in 1952. Dean Martin saved him, and Frank spent the next 43 years making music that changed the world. Your comeback is waiting. You just need to give it a chance to happen. This is Dean Martin, the untold legacy. Keep swinging, Pally, and keep your friends close. If you or someone you know is struggling, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24/7, 988.